Hi, I'm Clifford Bates, and welcome once again to reading Carl Schmitt. Today we are looking at, well, we're looking at part two, chapter two of Schmitt's, what's called parliamentary book, Parlamentarismus. It's very German. It's like the condition. It's a really ridiculous title. It's translated as the crisis of parliamentary liberal. Is it the crisis of liberal democracy? The crisis of parliamentary democracy. Sorry, it's up there in the corner. Blah. The Crisis of Parliamentary Democracy by Eileen Kelly and MIT back in 1888. I remember when this came out. It was like, oh, good. Oh my God, this was great. Oh, it was like um, there was a moment of MIT published like two or three editions of Schmitt translations, and there was kind of like a revival. A lot of liberals, like I remember, what was it? A very famous liberal. Oh God, he was at the University of Chicago, then later moved to uh, 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 I think Columbia or NYU. I think Columbia. Stephen Holmes. Stephen Holmes. Yes, I remember that. Stephen Holmes, and in fact, he wrote a review of this. I think it was in the New York Review of Books, but it could be. It also could be National Republic, if I remember correctly. I don't remember. But he then republished it in the volume "The Anatomy of Anti-Liberalism," with also his attack on Strauss, which was originally published in the APSR. Um, uh, uh, um, a very attack on Leo Strauss. So this idea of Schmitt's vitalizing this book was very interesting. Now, today we're looking at chapter two, which deals with parliament. Chapter one dealt with democracy, to the most part. Okay, the trajectory. He gave kind of history of democracy, arguing that so far democracy and parliamentarianism was basically in 19th century parliamentarianism and democracy were seen as essential. But then he describes the trajectory. First, had to get an understanding of what democracy was and the trajectory of democracy and why it goes into it. Now he's going to talk about parliamentarianism and the struggle between parliament and monarchy. A government that was decisively influenced by the representative of the people was called a parliamentary government, and the word was thus applied to a particular kind of executive. The meaning of the concept of parliamentarism was thereby changed. Parliamentary government presupposes a parliament, um, and to demand such a government means that one begins with parliament as the existing institution in order to extend its powers. Or in the customary language of constitutionalism, the legislative should influence the executive. The fundamental concept of the parliamentary principle cannot rest solely on the participation of parliament in government. And so, as the question that arises here is concerned, it cannot be expected that a discussion of this postulate of parliamentary government would produce much. In other words, it's not merely that they have a parliament. In other words, it's not merely that parliamentary principle cannot solely rest on the participation of parliament in the government, that every government has a parliament in it, or a working legislature. This won't produce much. We are concerned here with the ultimate intellectual foundation of parliamentarianism itself, not with the extension of the power of parliament. So therefore, we're interested in the concept of what is the foundations of what parliamentarianism, um, and not with an extension of the power of Parliament. Right? Why has Parliament been, in fact, the ultimate sapient? Again, Latin. This is Latin. I don't have the ability to highlight and say, see, highlight and pull the words here. So, ultimate, that means the highest, and the rationality, the highest rationality, sapience, highest rationality for many generations. The highest form of this kind of highest point of our ideas, our sapience, our consciousness, right? The fact that the ultimate, Well, I mean, that for many generations, and on what has the belief of this institution rested for over a century. So therefore, this it's the ultimate kind of idea of rationale that Parliament should be there. This is for over a century. We can say 1900s. In England, a little longer. You could say 1700s. The rise of 1688. Longer in England, but in Germany, in Europe, it's post-revolution, post-Revolution. So, and he's writing in the 20s and late 20s. So, this is that point, right? A demand that Parliament must control the government and influence the selection of ministers who are responsible to it assumes that belief. So, therefore, the idea of parliamentary supremacy, that Parliament is the hard board, it controls who's the ministers, it will appoint a selection of the ministers who are responsible towards it. Parliament responsible to the Parliament. So, who controls the government? In other words, the government is controlled by the Parliament. The oldest justification of Parliament, consistently repeated through the centuries, take into account the extreme expedient. In other words, this idea of the extreme expedient, and he's saying here, right? The justification of this, the people in its entirety must decide, as was the original case when all members of the community could assemble themselves under a village tree. So the idea that the old tradition was that we everyone together, they hold together. This idea that we deliberate, in other words, they come to decide. In other words, the Parliament is there as the justification is that it was the body that decided, right? And there was time when the people came together under a tree, he says, and they deliberated, right? This idea, um, the entire people in its entirety must decide, right? It says. But for the practical reason, it was impossible today for everyone to come together at the same time in one place. It was also impossible to ask everyone about every detail. So therefore, there's two problems. The original idea was everyone. The original conception of politics, political deliberation, those who are going to be would come together to rule. Right. This is the idea of this. But today, society it's just too large, and not everyone can ask. In other words, he says twofold. It's not possible to bring everyone together at one time, place, and time in the same time in one place, and it's also impossible. It's for practical reasons, right? It's impossible to do that, and it's also impossible to ask everyone about every detail. Because of this, one helps oneself quite reasonably with an elected committee of responsible people. The idea of representation, right? We create representatives. The idea we create instead of that we can't all participate. So instead of us all participating, we create a body who will that bodies represent that we will create bodies of people representing us in a sense, right? Um, Because of this, one helps oneself reasonably with an elected committee of reasonable, responsible people. And Parliament is precisely that the idea of representation, the idea of representative government, right? This is a parliamentary structure. We don't have the ability to come. So, therefore, the one argument of deliberation, of deciding that Parliament is a product of the idea of, well, we can't all just have an assembly that all participate because it's not practically possible because we're too large of a community. So therefore, the size problem, and therefore we get the creation of a representational entity, right? That we then, therefore, every community, every locality will send a representative to the collective this deliberative body and act, and they will be chosen to represent, and they will decide because they have been chosen to make the decisions to decide what is to be done, right? So the familiar scale originated. Parliament is a committee of the people. The government is a committee of parliament, right? This is the idea. So therefore, the parliament is the committee of people, and the government is the committee of parliament, right? This is the structure. Um, the notion of parliamentarian today appeals somewhat essentially democrat, appears to be something essentially democratic. But in spite of all its coincidence with democratic ideas and all the connections it has to them, Parliamentarianism is not democracy any more than it is realized in the practice of perspective of expediency. In other words, this looks democratic in that sense. This looks, okay, this has a democratic thing, and he's saying, well, in spite of all the coincidence of democratic ideas and the connections it has to them, Parliament is not democracy any more than it is the realize that it is realized in the practical perspective of expedience. This question here, that it's realized in the practical expedience. For if practical and technical reasons the representatives of the people can decide instead of the people themselves, then certainly a single trusted representative who also decides in the name of the same people. In other words, if you can delegate your decision, why not delegate it to one rather than many? This is a very Hobbesian point. This is the kind of Hobbes, it's better to have it one. And ruling by committee is kind of like stupid. This idea, this is government by committee is always the worst. Therefore, the idea of it should be more effective to have one, and that's it. This is the idea. Without ceasing to be democratic, the argument would justify the anti-parliamentary Caesarism. So, in other words, this idea that Caesarism is anti-democracy, no, it's not. Dictatorship is anti-democracy, which we will argue in his, maybe even argue in his. This book is written. I think this book 23, 24. I think it's written just about the time, or maybe slightly after his dictatorship. Oh, let me not open my mouth. Hold on. Yeah, it's written 2 years. It's published in 23, and dictatorship is 21. So it's published like 2 years. It's comes about a year or two after his dictatorship. So let's continue here. So Caesarism is not this. Consequently, this cannot be specific to the idea of parliamentarism. And the essential point is not that Parliament is a committee of the people. A council of trusted men. There is even a contradiction here in that Parliament, as the first committee, is independent of the people through the electoral period and is not usually subject to recall, whereas the parliamentary government, the secondary committee, is always dependent on the trust of the first committee and can therefore be recalled at any time. So you have government. So the government collapses, and therefore the parliament itself can be. The people can't recall the members of parliament, but in other words, there's a thing about the way government operates, right? A recall of the government, and that if there can be a new coalition found, there can't be then a new majority or agreement of a new government. If that new government can't be found, then what happens is the new election has to go. But the rule is that the new election is not. People don't call the election; they call the election themselves, right? The ratio of the ratio, the reasoning of just ratio, the reason of Parliament, the ratio of the logic or reasoning of Parliament rests, according to the apt characterization of Adolf Schmitt, in the in a dynamic dialectic. Dynamic. This reason that is in a process of confrontation of differences in opinions, from which the real political will result. So therefore, this idea of dynamic, of dialectic. Debate, deliberation. He's talking about deliberation. Now, the Greeks understood this, and Aristotle discussed this in the purpose of deliberation, and I think it's book 4, third to last chapter of book 4, where he talks about deliberative offices. The offices of the offices that deal with public deliberation, right? This is that. Now, it can also understand as contestation of interests. This is how maybe the modern economists would do it, right? Or the modern public interest group theory would do it, not deliberation. This is the difference with deliberate. So therefore, that is that is a process of confrontation of differences and opinions, from which the real political result. The essence of parliament is therefore public deliberation of arguments and counter arguments, public debate and public discussion and parley, and all this without taking democracy into account. So therefore, this is the idea that really the issue is discussion, deliberation, not taking, because you can have a parliament in an oligarchy and a democracy. This is Parliament is a place where the ruling body, the body deliberates, the ruling part deliberates in that sense, and who the ruling this is Aristotle's account of it, right? The absolutely typical chain of thought is to be found in the absolutely typical representative of parliamentarism, Guzot. I can never say his name, Guzot. I mean, the guy, I know this guy. We've been kind of pen pals for a long time now. Since I met him in the '90s, he has a nice job. He has a very good job at Indiana University, Indiana University of Indiana, Bloomington. Ariel, I can never say his Romanian and Korean. He became, his real interest was the French liberals, all these French, Tocqueville, Guizot. In fact, I think Guizot's book on, yeah, I mean, Liberty Fund published the kind of history of civilization book, his book on that, but also the idea of representative government. I think Ariel was translated that and was he edited that for them, and he did several books on this. And he's also now more famous for his so-called the faces of moderation and this idea of moderation. He's a moderate type. He makes his argument of this. I've always had a criticism of this. I mean, he was very, he tends to give praise to people like Michnik in Poland, and as being, oh, this is responsible. He was a middle person and therefore more moderate. Where I see anyone who knows Polish politics and the inside of Polish politics knows how self-serving and destructive Michnik was in owns the Gazeta Wyborcza, and how he played in destabilizing the Polish political landscape for his own purpose, his own wealth and inside interest and power. Um, and may have even been an agent acting the Polish president Wałęsa, who was may have been an agent of influence in that sense, or an agent of information to the old security services. We don't know. We know that Wałęsa was, but this is clear and evident now by the documents. But Michnik was under suspicion. He defended the old regime once it lost power, and he kind of this is what I mean. This is why you can see his role first as a critic, and then after when the regime overfell. So again, this is my problem. Let's go back. Let's forget about this. But Guizot is this liberal in a sense. This liberal constitutional. His book on representational government in that sense is important. Very important book on this point. Um, and therefore, this is what he says here. It says in Guizot, starting, in other words, the typical absolute chain of thought is found in the typical representative parliamentary. That is in Guizot, his famous book on representative government. Starting from right as the opposite to might, right from might, right. He lists the essential characteristics of the system that guarantees the rule of law. So therefore, these are the characteristics of that promises the rule of law, right? The powers, one, that the powers are always forced to discuss and thereby to seek the truth together. Two, that the openness of the whole of the political process places the powers under citizens' control. And three, that the press freedom prompts citizens to seek truth for themselves and to make it known to the powers. Right. So these are the three kind of characteristics. These are the things that guarantees the system that guarantees the rule of law. Right. Parliament is accordingly the place in which which Particles of reason that are strewn unequally among human beings gather themselves and bring public power under their control. So Parliament is that all the individual bits are put together in Parliament in that sense. This idea of Parliament is according to the place which particles of reason that are strewn unequally among human beings gather themselves. And this is again echoed in Aristotle's book 3, I think chapter 11, or not chapter 11, chapter 12, I think chapter 11, where he says that many together deliberate better than even the one wise, right? As long as they're not slavers, right? So, this appears a typical rationalist idea. Nevertheless, it would be incomplete and exact to define the modern parliament as an institution that has come into existence out of the rationalist spirit. So, in other words, it would be incomplete, and in other words, it appears to be a rationalist idea. This idea of deliberation, how deliberate, but it would be incomplete and inexact to define the modern parliament as this to come out of existence of rational spirit. Its ultimate justification and its obviousness is to a whole epoch rests on the fact that this rationalism is not absolute and direct, but relative in a specific sense. Right? This idea that it's not absolute. This is why it's not purely rationalistic. The idea here is that no, not every. And let's go now. Against Guzot's maxim, right? Moll objected. Where is there any kind of certainty that the possessors of particles of reason are to be found precisely in this parliament? In Parliament, the answer lies in the notion of free competition and a pre-established harmony, which certainly in the institutions of Parliament, as in politics itself, often appears in the hardly recognizable disguises. So therefore, this is the argument. In other words, his argument is that there's no proof that this happens. These people, and they're going to be the ones who have the reasoning. This is Moll's response to Gusot. But then the argument is that no, this is, in other words, out here is that this is going to be a representative sample. This is going to be a not representative sample. The people are going to pick the people who they think is better and good judge, right? The argument goes. That's the argument that is made in the Federalist Papers, right? You elect that the voters will tend to look at the neighbors and pick the ones that. Now, but that's not true. What ends up happening, right? But the idea here is that case, right? And therefore, he says the answer lies in a notion that free competition and pre-established harmony, right? The community's harmony, the pre-established harmony within a community. Which certainly in the institution of Parliament, as in politics itself, often appears in a hardly recognizable disguise. So it's there, but it is essential that liberalism be understood as a consistent, comprehensive metaphysical system. So liberalism is this metaphysical system. Normally one not discussed in economic line. Normally one only discussed an economic line of reasoning, that of social harmony and the maximization of wealth, follow from the free economic competition of individuals, from freedom from contract, freedom of trade, and free enterprise. So the typical understanding of liberalism is the idea of this is economic, right? That's usually divided by, and he says gives the thing. Normally discussed from economic line of reasoning, that of social harmony and maximization of wealth, follow from free enterprise, economic competition of individuals, from freedom of contract, freedom of trade, and free enterprise, right? But all this is only an application of a general liberal principle. It is exactly the same, that the truth can be found through an and this is something you hear in people like Jordan Peterson, the idea of free, and why free speech is important, right? This is like Jordan Peterson's kind of argument, why free speech is important. I think Schmitt's pointing out this here to the same point. In other words, truth can be found through an unrestrained crash of opinion, and that competition will produce harmony. It is exactly the same, right? So that the truth can be found through an unrestrained clash of opinion, and that the competition will produce harmony. The intellectual core of this thought resides finally in the specific relationship to truth, which becomes a mere function of the external competition of opinions. In contrast to the truth, it means renouncing a definite result. In German thought, the notion of external discussion was more accessible in the romantic conception of the unending conversation, and may be remarked in passing that all the intellectual confusion of the conventional reading of German political romanticism, which characterizes it as conservative and anti-liberal, is revealed in precisely this connection. In other words, this is why that romanticism is that point, which is the conversation. In other words, this is the point, and this is important. Liberalism, and this is something Strauss, in his preface to his Spinoza book, book on Spinoza on religion, which is written, the preface is written in 1968, the book was written in 1930, basically makes a point about this, that the idea is that liberalism, the German tradition of liberalism happens at the same time as romanticism. The rise of liberalism and the rise of romanticism are kind of this idea that romanticism is a rejection of liberalism. Yes, it can be. There's some romantics that are, but no. It is, this is why he says that all the internal intellectual confusion of the conventional reading of German romanticism, political romanticism, which characterizes that conservative anti-liberal, is revealed in precisely this connection. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, freedom of discussion are not only useful and expedient, therefore, but really life and death questions for liberalism. So it's not expedient, but these things are not merely expedient, but existential, life or death. Guizot's description placed particular emphasis on freedom of the press as the third characteristic of parliamentarism, after discussion and openness. One can easily see that freedom of the press is only a means for discussion and openness and not an independent factor. So the idea is that, in other words, freedom of the press is not independent. He says, is only a means for discussion and openness and not an independent. But since a free press is a typical means for the other characteristic features of liberalism, Guizot is quite justified in giving it as a particular emphasis. So therefore, this idea that private press, the private power, right, the private ownership, right, only in its certain central place of discussion is the liberal systems correctly recognized. So recognized do the two political demands that are characteristic of liberal rationalism take their proper significance with a scientific clarity above the confused atmospheres of slogan, political tactics, and pragmatic considerations. What is that? The absolute postulate of openness in political life and the demand for a division of powers, or more specifically, the theory of a balance of opposing forces from which truth will emerge automatically as an equilibrium. So therefore, this is what it means. In other words, two things. Openness, the postulate for openness in political life, and a balance of powers, which a balancing of opposing forces, the division of power, in other words, the division of powers, but division of powers really means a balancing. It is, in other words, or this is more specifically, division of power means the theory of a balance of opposing forces from which truth emerges automatically as an equilibrium. That's the whole idea. We want balance of powers to prevent all power getting into so much hand, to prevent despotism. This is why balance. This is why someone like Montesquieu. This is the liberalism in Montesquieu. This idea of balance and moderation by the balancing powers. This is why I've always I like Montesquieu. I think Montesquieu's right here, and I have criticism of liberalism. But I think this point is right about liberal. This is liberalism's best point. The idea is that we need to have this, and that's why I can be sympathetic to when I hear people like Peterson. I can be sympathetic to some of what Peterson says. I mean, I'm more sympathetic than hostile to him, but I also see his limits. I also see the rationalism and the radical individualism that doesn't understand, that fails to take into account communities and groups. But at the same time, he does. So it's weird. It's this is the oddity of Peterson in that sense. Okay, oh, sorry, needed to put the on hold. So let's go like this. Okay, so because of the decisive importance of openness and especially the power of public opinion in liberal thought, it appears that liberalism and democracy are identical here. So polarization. Um, and theory, in other words, so therefore, this idea between the importance of public opinion and liberal thought, the decisive importances and the power of public opinion, this is where they look. Liberalism and democracy appears identical, right? On these, on the contrary, are used by Hasbach in order to construct the sharpest contrast between liberty and democracy. A threshold, a threshold division of powers, a substantial distinction between the legislative and the executive, the rejection of the idea that the plenitude of state powers should be allowed to gather at any one point. All of this is in fact the antithesis of a democratic conception of identity. So Hasbach said, listen, he says the threefold division of powers, a threefold division of powers, a substantial distinction between the legislative and the executive, the rejection of the idea of the plenitude of state powers should be allowed to gather at any point. In other words, that all the state power, there can't be all the powers that cannot be under one thing. All of this is, in fact, the antithesis of democratic concept of identity. The two postulates are thus not simple equivalents of the many very different ideas. In fact, you can say Hausbach is criticizing the American model, you can say, right? The American division of power model in that sense. That it's not democratic. This is the idea. This is, in that sense, the idea of separation. You have this complete distinction of the legislative and the executive are independent. All executive power, all the powers are under most of the plenitude of state powers are under they're created in that of this, but they emerge from this and they Congress and they exercised and controlled by that, right? This is kind of maybe the criticism in that sense, right? The two, one of many of very different ideas connected to these two demands. Only those are essential for the understanding of the intellectual center and of modern parliamentarian that be considered here. So, what are they? One, openness. And I think I'm going to stop here. I think the introduction, I think this is a place to stop. I think I'm going to continue book chapter 2 um, um, with this, chapter 2.1, chapter 2. So, chapter 2, the chapter 2.1, openness. Then I'm going to break it up because I think this is going to be too long. So, we'll stop here. Okay, if you have any comments or criticism, please put in the comments and questions below, and I will. And when I see them, I will. Okay, let me do this. When I see them, I will respond to them, and I'll respond to them. So please, any comments, questions, please put below. If you liked it, like it. If you didn't like it, no, okay, but like it, share it with a friend. If you didn't like it, of course, you can say no, hit no, but then say why in the comments. But if you liked it, hit the like button. If you share if you really liked it, share with a friend, share in social media, spread the news. If you've not sharing your, so get it out there. If you've not subscribed, subscribe. If you know someone who might be interested, encourage them to subscribe to the growth channel. We're on. I like to throw a kind of another party. I like to get the 500, have the 500 party. Yay, the 500! Yay! I need to get to 2,000, right? Eventually, this is the score, but this so I can get monetized and make some money. But who knows? This is the trial of what's going to do. So, again, questions in that sense. Uh, if you want to follow me on social media, my social media links below. Also below are my so-called academic social media about my scholarship and where I am. The different the academic sites of that. Um, you know, then there is, if you want to help me to do what I do, um, here and maybe help me expand, help me do these things, you can become a patron. You can be a supporter, a patron, by Patreon or Subscribe Star, right? I understand people don't like Patreon. Some people don't like this. So if I got no one to like anyone, somebody it helped. By doing this small thing, you can help me do what I do, or help me do it. Help finance this a little bit because it's not financing us. It's being wholly financed by me right now, and it's expensive, as I know. Um, um, that's it in that sense. What else? Oh, yeah, if you want to help me, you can buy one of my books that is listed below. If you have not bought one already, you can buy the three links, the three books there below. Um, maybe I should do another little book soon. I'm thinking about it. I'm doing my own big research book soon, whatever. So, voila, that's it. I don't know what else to say. I hope that's everything's okay. Um, uh, we will continue this Thursday, Friday. We'll continue on part one, openness, um, and then look at part. We'll continue this on there. It's going to extend this out a little longer than I thought it would. So therefore, take care and have a good day. Bye bye.